Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. This week I've been working on these four books. The grammar book, an ESL/EFL teacher's course by Marianne Celce-Murcia and Diane Larsen-Freeman. Apologies for this camera showing everything in mirror image. It's gonna be like that all the way through the video. The Complete Illustrated Tales of the Brothers Grimm by the Brothers Grimm, Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. So we'll start with Charlotte's Web first, because it's the book I have the least to say about. And the reason I have the least to say about is because I already finished it and reviewed it on this channel. The book took me a day and a half to read, so I started it this week, I finished it this week, and I've reviewed it this week. So you can check out the review I have on this channel, but I've already talked all about it, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I started I think on Friday, and I finished it Saturday evening. It's Saturday evening Vietnam time. So it's another book that took me a day and a half to read. I could easily have done it in one day if I had nothing else to do and if I had been pushing myself a bit. It's a very quick read. Actually, both of these were very quick reads, which you know, I've made this point before on this channel, but it's maybe something that deserves repeating. I've started keeping track of the amount of pages I read each week since I've started doing this weekly reading vlog. I don't know, just because it was something that seemed like people do to keep track of how many pages they read. But it really is kind of silly, isn't it? Because, you know, like, one page out of this book or this book is not even close to the amount of intellectual effort I have to do to get one page out of this book. Not to mention the type size and the actual physical size of the pages. So this whole thing about keeping track of page counts does seem a little bit silly, doesn't it? And for that matter, even keeping track of how many books you read in a year. I mean, this book is not even close to equaling this book. So all these metrics by which we measure our reading are artificial. But, you know, what other way can you do it, huh? I'm going to continue keeping track of my page counts each week just because, well, just for the sake of doing it. But yeah, it is rather silly. This was such an easy book to get through. These both were, as you would expect. They're children's books. So yeah, this is another book where I completely finished it this week, and I don't want to say too much about it because hopefully within the next couple days I'm going to come back with a full video in which I review this book. There's really not that much to say, really. Like with Charlotte's Web, I was talking about some of the adult themes of the book and stuff like that. But with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, in my opinion, this book was just all fun. You know, it was just a fun book, and there's not much to talk about except how fun it was. And it was a lot of fun. These are both rereads from childhood. I had read this book, or at any rate had it read to me by a teacher. But I had completely forgotten just how much fun this book was. I was smiling so much while I was reading this book. I was constantly saying to my wife, "Oh, listen to this part, listen to this part," even though she had read it. She had read it before I did. But yeah, it was just... I've forgotten how much fun Roald Dahl was and how funny these books were. And I'm not sure there's really much more to say about this, although when I do the full review sometime later this week, probably. My system is, the current system is, I finished writing out the written review, and then I film the video review after I finished writing out the written review. It somewhat depends on how much time I have during the week to write the written review, because writing takes time. These video reviews, I just turn on the camera and ramble, but the writing takes time. So I don't know, it could be a couple days, hopefully not much more than that. I do have a bit of a busy week coming up in terms of work, but hopefully in a couple days I'll finish the written review, and then I'll come back on the channel and give a full video review of it, and then I'm not going to talk any more about it in this particular video. The grammar book, I said last week that my progress has slowed on this book because during this lockdown here in Vietnam, and here in Vietnam we're in another lockdown, I just have not really felt like I had it in me to do a lot of heavy-duty professional development reading. And that has continued this week. I read 10 pages. I made it from page 144 to 154, all in the same chapter, still in the chapter on modal auxiliaries, which I'm almost to the end of now, but haven't finished that chapter yet. And who knows, the next week could also be similar. There is some interesting stuff in here. It's talking about the difference between can and am able to. Talking about the difference between them, especially in the past tense. For example, sorry, I know this is going to show up in mirror image, but if you say could, can in the past tense is could, presumably, although the authors of this book dispute that modals have past forms, at least in modern English. But it is rendered as could. And if you say, for example, I was able to go to Disney World, in the past tense, that strongly implies that you went. But if you say I could go to Disney World, it's a bit unclear, and maybe the implication is you had the opportunity, but you didn't go. I used this on my wife actually the other day, who is Vietnamese and is speaking English as a second language, and she was saying, oh, the really good thing when I went to the store is I could buy some eggs. It's getting a little bit hard to get groceries here in Vietnam during the COVID lockdown. So she was excited about that. She said I could buy some eggs. I said, wait a minute. And I got out the grammar book, and she said, oh no, what mistake did I make with my English now? I had it right open to that page because I was just reading it this week. And I said, okay, so if you use could for the past tense, that implies that you had the opportunity to buy the eggs, but it's not clear whether or not you bought the eggs. You want to say, I was able to buy the eggs. Whether or not this explicit correction actually works is a long-standing debate in second language acquisition, but I usually take the opportunity to bring these things up when they come up. And I had just been reading about that just this week when my wife said that. But yeah, other than that, I think I'm just going to leave it there and move on to the Brothers Grimm. Now, I'm slogging my way through the complete Brothers Grimm. There's 210 stories in here with 845 pages. I'd been making pretty good progress the previous couple weeks. Progress has slowed this week. I only read 38 pages, and again, the main reason for that, a couple of reasons for that. Big reason for that is I've been reading other children's books. But the other reason is I am getting a little bit burnt out on these Brothers Grimm stories. Some of them are really good, and some of them are not so good, but they are all the same, or the tone of them feels very much the samey. Even though these stories were allegedly collected from, they weren't actually written by the same authors. They were collected by the Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, but they feel like they're all the same, certainly. So this week I read story 111 in the canonical order, The Skillful Huntsman, which has a lot of elements that are familiar. One element is it really feels like a bunch of stories in one, which a lot of these Grimm brothers stories do. So it starts off, there's a young fellow. Oh wait, sorry, I might be getting this mixed up. What happened in the Skillful Huntsman? Okay, sorry. Skillful Huntsman. He's going out to make his way in the world. He gets a gun that no matter what you shoot at it, you can't miss. He falls in with some giants, and the giants have in mind to go to a castle to get the princess. So he pretends like he's going in with them, but then he actually just cuts off their head and cuts out their tongues. Spoilers, by the way, sorry. And then he falls asleep, and the captain of the guard takes credit for having killed the dragon, for having killed the giants instead of him. And the princess is sworn to secrecy, which is something that happens a lot in these books. In these stories. There are certain things which just happen over and over and over again, which again makes it tiring to read too much of them at once. And one of the things that happens over and over again is that somebody else will take credit for rescuing the maiden or rescuing the princess. And the princess is sworn to secrecy. The princess can't reveal for whatever reason, that the person who is taking credit for it is not actually the person who saved her. But then, these are all running. It's hard for me to remember actually the details of them because they all run together in my head. They all have very similar plot details. But yeah, the huntsman. Yeah, so she refuses to marry the captain, and the huntsman comes back and reveals himself, and then the captain is put in prison and torn in 4 pieces. There's quite frequently a gruesome end to the villains. It's not just that they're killed; it's that they're killed in very specific or graphic ways. And then the huntsman marries the princess. Then number 12, Flail from Heaven. This one was actually quite enjoyable. It's a short little story about this country peasant who goes up and he sees what's going on in heaven. You can see it's just a page and a little bit long, and a lot of them are quite short. And then there's the 2 Kings' Children. Yeah, so this is one of those stories that is actually seems like it's several stories in once. It says, there was once upon a time a king who had a little boy of whom it had been foretold that he should be killed by a stag when he was 16 years of age. So it's set up that there's some sort of prophecy that a stag is going to kill him. But then that gets dropped fairly early on and we never hear from it again. He goes hunting the stag, but when they're far into the forest, the stag turns into a tall man who is actually a king. And the king brings him back to his castle to marry his daughters. but he has a task that he has to stay awake all night. And it turns out that the king really doesn't want him to marry his daughter, so he keeps making the tasks more and more difficult. Now, why the king brought him back to the castle to set him on these tasks is never explained, which is quite typical of these stories. The character motivations are never explained, and I mean, to a certain extent, fair enough. These are folk tales. You don't expect in-depth psychological examinations of the characters. On the other hand, this is another reason why it can be a little bit of a slog to read through all of these books. And why I'm not quite sure I would recommend that anyone else take this on as a reading project. But I'm going to keep slogging on. So he sleeps in the first task he has is he has to stay awake all night in the room of the eldest princess. But the princesses in this story are on his side. So the eldest princess says, okay, you can go to sleep. The statue of St. Christopher is going to answer the questions if anyone shows up. So, the king calls out to see if he's awake, but the statue of St. Christopher answers the question for him. So the king thinks he's actually staying awake all night, and actually the statue is answering for him. Oh, I forgot to mention this, but if he falls asleep, or the king catches him falling asleep, the penalty is death, which also happens all the time in these stories. There's some sort of task where if you can do it, you marry the princess, and if you can't do it, you get put to death. That is all throughout this book. But then the king doesn't want to have him marry the princess, so then he goes to the second princess, the next eldest princess, where he's got the same task, and the exact same thing happens with the statue of St. Christopher. And then it goes to the third princess, the youngest princess, which, again, is all throughout these stories where things happen in threes. And I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, because you're familiar, of course, with things happening in threes as being a trope of fairy tales or myths or legends. Nonetheless, it is yet another thing that can make this a bit tiring to read through the complete Grimm's Brother, because you're like, okay, I know it's going to happen in threes and the same exact thing. But then the king still doesn't want to give his daughters in marriage. So he has all these tasks that he wants him to do. Like, what does he want him to do? He wants him to go out in the forest and cut down all the trees. Or he wants him to dig a big trench, or he wants him to build a big castle. And every time he gives him some glass tools, which the glass tools, of course, shatter as soon as he tries to use them to dig the hole or cut down the trees, which, of course, is the point. The king doesn't want to give his daughters away. And then the youngest daughter, who's on his side, will comb his hair and kind of lull him to sleep. And then she'll summon these men from the earth, these little men from the earth who are called earth workers. And they will perform the task. And again, this happens, I think, 3 times or more than 3 times. It happens several times. And by the time you're a couple repetitions in, as story devices go, it's really not that clever. The king will have some impossible task. The princess will lull him to sleep, and then she'll summon her earth workers, and they'll go and they'll do the task for him. And you're like, okay, well, fine. But repeating that over and over again gets tiresome quickly, because it was never really that clever to begin with. There's nothing more to it. The earth workers just appear, they do the task, and then they go away. So then finally, the when they've completed all the tasks and the king still doesn't want to give his daughter away, they run away together, and then the king is following her. And as the king is following them, the daughter transforms them into a rose and a briar patch. So she is the rose and he is the briar patch. And then the king goes back again, and then he comes again, and they transform himself into a church and a priest. And then this time the king goes back, and now the queen is pursuing them. And the daughter who has magic transforms herself into a pond and transforms the prince into a fish. Now, this has, as far as I can remember, popped up twice before now in these Brothers Grimm stories. So this is the third time I think this is popping up now. And it's an oddly specific detail that pops up repeatedly, where they're being pursued, and there's a man and a woman, and sometimes I think they're brother and sister, sometimes they're lovers, but at any rate, they're being pursued, and the woman transforms themselves into some sort of church, some sort of flower and vine or thorn bush, and some sort of pond and creature inside the pond. That oddly specific detail has come up. I think this is the third time now that's been repeated, which must have happened because these are folk tales. So you can imagine that the folk tales are being told and retold and going from village to village, and you can imagine that as they're going around the villages, some of the details are staying the same and some of the details are changing, which is how you can have these very specific details popping up several times within different stories, especially because the Grimm brothers were not going to China or anything for their folklore tales. I think they were mainly coming from Germany or some regions of France, maybe. But I think mostly coming from Germany, these stories. So within a very specific geographical region, then, you can see how these story details are mutating into different stories. Which, if you're a folklorist, or if you're doing a serious study of this, I guess that would be an interesting detail to study, the different ways these very specific details manifest themselves across the stories. If you're reading these stories for entertainment, though, again, like a lot of things, it can be a bit tiresome. You can be like, oh, okay, this detail again. And it's something you start noticing before you're even, before you're even 50 pages into the Brothers Grimm, is how much the story details are repeating. It's something you really notice when you're on 500 pages in. And then finally the queen gives up, and she gives her daughter a gift of 3 walnuts. Each one has a beautiful dress in it, which is a detail which has come up in a story before. And then they go back to their kingdom, and immediately the prince forgets all about this princess who had come with him, and he gets engaged to a different woman, which is another detail that's come up in a few different stories before. And some of the stories before, this has been explained by some sort of magic or something. But in this story, it's not explained at all. He just promptly forgets about her as soon as he gets back into his kingdom, which happens a lot in these Brothers Grimm stories. Something will happen with just no explanation at all. Why does he forget about her just because the plot dictates it? So by using these walnuts, each walnut has a magic dress in it that the princess is able to use to get people's attention. And then the other woman who is engaged to the prince, in exchange for the dress, is willing to trade one night with the prince. So her plan is that she's going to go in and talk to the prince and say, "Don't you remember me? I did all these things for you. I saved your life and used all this magic." And it's a bit strange because she had all this magic at the beginning of the story, but she doesn't have it now. She's just reduced to pleading with the prince. But every time she goes into the prince's room, he sleeps all the way through the night and he doesn't hear her pleading to try and remember him. Which is another detail that has popped up in stories before. The idea of the princess going into the room and the prince just sleeping. So she, one night she does it and he sleeps all the way through, and then 2 nights she does it and he sleeps all the way through, and then the third night, I think in the previous stories, I think one of the servants had let the princess know that there was a sleeping potion. In this story, I think in this story it happens in the second night, and the servant tells the prince himself about the sleeping potion. So I'm probably making a mess of this and not retelling these stories with any specific skill. But the point I'm trying to make by retelling this whole story is, first of all, it's like 3 different stories mashed into one. But then, as is quite common with these Grimm stories. But then, second of all of the details from the story are other details that we've already seen in previous stories. They're just presented here in a new combination, which, as you get further and further into it, is just the same details, just in different combinations. Story 114, I read The Cunning Little Tailor. Story 115, The Bright Sun Brings It to Light, is interesting because I was talking last week about anti-Semitism in the stories. And this is yet another story which involves a Jewish character and the stereotype of Jews having money. In Wikipedia, I was reading this on Wikipedia, and somebody on Wikipedia had listed this as yet another example of anti-Semitism in the Brothers Grimm. But then if you go to the talk section on Wikipedia, somebody else was saying, actually, no, it's not anti-Semitic, this story. And I can see definitely why they're saying it's not anti-Semitic, because the Jew in this story is actually being portrayed in a sympathetic light. What happens is somebody is traveling down the road. He sees a Jew, and he attacks and kills the Jew because he thinks the Jew must have lots of money. But the Jew says, no, I only have a little bit of money. How much was it? It's going to be in some sort of denomination I don't really understand. 8 farthings, however much a farthing is. So he kills the Jew and takes 8 farthings, and the Jew says the sunlight is going to bring this to light before he dies. And then the guy goes back and he gets married and he has kids, and one day he's eating soup, and the sun is shining on the soup and then reflecting up on the ceiling. And the guy said, the sun is trying to bring my crime to light, but it's not going to work. And his wife said, what are you talking about? And he says to his wife, okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise not to tell anyone. And he tells the story about how he killed the Jew and how the Jew said the sun would bring it to light. And his wife tells her best friend, and his wife tells the best friend, okay, you have to promise not to tell anyone. And then within a day, the whole village knows. And so then he's found out for his crime, and he's brought to trial and condemned. Doesn't say he is hung for it, although quite commonly they're hung at the end of the stories. These Brothers Grimm stories always have a gruesome end. And so in a way, the prophecy did come true. The sun did bring it to light, kind of. And so the argument was made, okay, that's not really an anti-Semitic story. The Jew is there in the story is the victim. And the guy who killed the Jew gets his reward at the end. And I think I see myself agreeing with that interpretation. Okay, my time is up here. I've rambled on for 30 minutes, so I'm going to finish the video here.